When it comes to promoting games, the early 2000s were, yeah, weird.
And their power will be magnificent.
But not a bad weird. I mean the kind of weird where you watch it back now and think, how did this ever make it on TV? These ads barely explained anything. Some of them didn't even really show any gameplay. But that wasn't an accident, because by the late 90s and the early 2000s, something had shifted. Gaming wasn't being sold as toys anymore. Companies knew gamers were getting older, and they didn't feel the need to over-explain every little thing. At the same time, tech was changing fast. The internet was evolving. Phones were starting to get smarter. Movies were getting darker, edgier, and even more stylized. And gaming ads, well, they changed right along with it. Ads have existed since the very beginning of gaming, but this was the point where they stopped trying to explain themselves and started focusing more on the feeling a console would give you. PlayStation, Xbox, and Nintendo all knew this going into this generation. The ads weren't really about specs or power anymore. They weren't trying to convince you with numbers. They were trying to show you who this console was really for. And once that shift happened, everything about gaming ads changed. Before all that, gaming ads were way more straightforward. They actually explain what you were buying. You see gameplay, you hear about the features. Sometimes, they straight up tell you why one console or game was better than the other. Think of Sega versus Nintendo.
What Nintendo?
A lot of these ads were still talking to parents, basically telling them, this is worth your money, this is fun, this is safe. Games were framed more like toys, bright colors, loud voices, a very clear messaging. And for a while, that worked. But as gaming started getting older, that style just didn't hit the same anymore, because the audience wasn't kids being introduced to games. It was teens who already knew what games were. They didn't need the instructions anymore. And this shift just didn't happen on TV. If you grew up reading gaming magazines, flipping through stuff like Game Informer or console magazines, the ads were in there were just as edgy, sometimes even more. You turn to the page and get hit with these dark and aggressive, almost uncomfortable ads, barely any text, weird imagery, but you just stop and stare at them. You know, as a kid, I actually had those magazines and I would rip the pages and post them on my wall. I didn't really know I was doing that. My parents were the ones that told me that I always had the PlayStation girls. I don't know what's going on with me as a kid, but there were some good ads. This is where the 2000s really separated themselves. Consoles stopped being sold as pieces of tech and started being sold as personality. Xbox ads were aggressive, sometimes uncomfortable, almost confrontational. They weren't trying to be friendly. They were basically saying that this isn't for everyone. But that's what made it really cool. PlayStation 2 went the opposite direction. Those ads were abstract, stylish, and sometimes confusing on purpose. They felt artsy, almost like short films.
Mankind went to the moon. I don't even know where Grimsby is. Land on your own moon.
And then you had the Nintendo GameCube. Nintendo was clearly trying harder than before to appeal to a more mature audience compared to the N64. Some people say they didn't like it and it didn't work for them, but honestly, I liked it, especially the live action trailers for some of their games. And by the way, those live action trailers that they would show for Metroid, wouldn't that be amazing for a live action movie? Now hear me out. With an alien vibe to it, all that isolation, the quiet, and just Samus exploring a planet, that would be amazing. Eventually though, things changed. Gaming went fully mainstream, the budgets got bigger, the risks got higher, and the marketing, well, it got safer. You can really see this by the time the Xbox 360 era rolls around. The ads were still stylish, of course, but they were way more controlled, with a cleaner branding, clear messaging, more data behind every decision that they did. Not worse, just different. Those 2000s ads could only exist in that moment, when gaming was still figuring itself out, when experimentation was normal, when nothing fully felt locked in yet. They were weird, they were messy, and sometimes uncomfortable. But they were memorable, and that's why we still talk about them to this day. Not because they were perfect, but because it was a time that they felt honest about who they were trying to market to.